Humans like to think we're the crown jewel of 4 billion years of biological R&D, the universe's greatest achievement, a masterpiece of natural engineering. And on the surface, that's a reasonable take. We've cured diseases, we've walked on the moon, we've invented double-stuffed Oreos. Not bad for a primate that's been around for a few 100,000 years. But here's the thing no one tells you in biology class. When you actually look at the blueprints, when you zoom in on the wiring, the structural engineering, the plumbing, the human body is a spectacular series of compromises, workarounds, and patches stacked on top of patches from 500 million years of evolution, just barely keeping up. Today, we're going through the receipts, the 5 most embarrassing design failures in the human body, backed by real evolutionary biology, real anatomy, and the genuine bewilderment of actual scientists who've spent careers staring at how weird we are. Let's start with something you do multiple times a day without thinking about it: eating. Specifically, swallowing. Every time you swallow food or liquid, it has to pass through a narrow passage in your throat called the pharynx. And here's the engineering problem. That same passage also carries every breath of air into your lungs. One passageway, 2 completely critical life-sustaining functions, sharing a junction in your throat. To prevent food from going into your lungs, your body evolved a small flap of tissue called the epiglottis. Every time you swallow, it folds down like a trapdoor over your trachea, sealing the airway while food slides past into your esophagus. The epiglottis works most of the time, but it's a reflex, meaning it can fail when you're laughing while eating, eating too fast, talking while chewing, or if you're elderly and the reflex is slowed down. And when it fails, food or liquid goes into your trachea. You choke. Around 5,000 Americans die from choking every year. That's not a rare edge case. It's one of the top 10 causes of accidental death. For adults over 65, it's even higher. All because of one pipe doing 2 jobs. No engineer designing a system from scratch would ever route a food delivery pipe through the same corridor as the main air intake. You'd get fired on the first day of engineering school. But why did evolution do this? Because we inherited this layout from our fish ancestors. Early vertebrates breathed and filtered food through the same oral cavity. Fish don't have this problem because they filter food through gills. When land animals emerged and needed to swallow solid food and breathe air, the same shared tube got repurposed. 400 million years later, we're still using that same basic setup, just with a flap and a prayer. For most of mammalian history, our ancestors moved on 4 legs. The spine was horizontal, essentially a suspension bridge, with the weight of internal organs hanging below it and the load distributed evenly across front and back limbs. Then, roughly 6 million years ago, our hominid ancestors started walking upright. Bipedalism was an incredible evolutionary advantage. It freed our hands, let us see farther over savanna grass, and made us more energy efficient over long distances. But nobody told the spine to redesign itself. Our spine kept its original horizontal bridge structure, the vertebrae, the discs, the curvature, and we just stood it up vertically. Now, instead of hanging below a bridge, the spine is stacked upright, carrying the entire weight of your head, torso, and arms on top of the narrowest point, your lumbar vertebrae, your lower back. The lumbar spine, that curve in your lower back, is trying to compensate. It developed an inward curve called lordosis specifically to help redistribute that load. But it's still fundamentally a retrofitted design, not an original one. The result? About 80% of adults will experience significant lower back pain at some point in their lives. It's one of the leading causes of disability globally. Not because people are weak or lazy, because we're running 21st century lives on a spine that evolved for a very different physical job description. And it gets worse, because our upright posture also changes the pressure distribution in our intervertebral discs, the shock-absorbing cushions between vertebrae. Sitting, which most of us do for hours every day, puts more pressure on those discs than standing, and slouching while sitting, even more. The discs were not designed for the chair. Herniated discs, sciatica, spinal stenosis, these aren't just bad luck. They're predictable consequences of a design that was never meant to go vertical. We traded horizontal stability for upright freedom, and our lower backs are still paying the invoice. This next one is what evolutionary biologists have called the obstetric dilemma, and it might be the starkest example of two evolutionary pressures crashing into each other with disastrous consequences. Here's the setup. For millions of years, human brains were getting bigger. Intelligence was such an enormous survival advantage, better tools, better social cooperation, better planning, that natural selection kept pushing for larger and larger brains. Larger brains mean larger skulls. At the exact same time, walking upright on two legs required our pelvis to rotate and narrow. Wider hips mean a less efficient bipedal gait. You'd have to waddle like a penguin, burning more energy with every step. So selection pressure also pushed toward narrower pelvises. The result? Modern human babies are born at a neurologically earlier developmental stage than any other primate, essentially premature by any comparative standard, because they literally cannot stay in the womb any longer without their skulls becoming too large to exit. This is called secondary ultraceality. We're born far more helpless than our primate cousins because we have to be. If we gestated long enough for the brain to reach comparable developmental maturity, the head simply would not fit through the birth canal. Human birth is extraordinarily complex compared to other primates. Our babies have to rotate their heads during delivery, a choreographed, tight maneuver through the pelvis that no other ape has to perform. It's a mechanism because it had to be engineered around a design flaw. The consequences of this mismatch are serious. Maternal mortality in childbirth historically has been far higher in humans than in other primates. Difficult labor, called dystocia, occurs in humans at dramatically elevated rates. This is not coincidence. This is two evolutionary selection pressures that never got a chance to compromise. Here's one that sounds like a bad joke but is completely real. Your eyes are wired backwards. The photoreceptor cells in your retina, the rods and cones that actually detect light, are pointed away from the light coming in. They face toward the back of your eye, toward the pigment layer. The light has to pass through multiple layers of nerve cells and blood vessels before it even reaches them. In a sensibly designed eye, the photoreceptors would face the incoming light. And in fact, cephalopods, octopuses and squids, have exactly that setup. Their eyes evolved independently and they got it right. Their wiring runs behind the retina, not in front of it. The consequence of our backwards wiring? The blind spot, where the nerve fibers bundled together have to exit the eye to reach the brain, the optic nerve. There are zero photoreceptors, none. It's a literal hole in your vision that your brain just fills in by guessing. Your brain is constantly hallucinating to cover up the gap in your vision. You're not seeing reality. You're seeing reality with a patch your brain painted over a missing section, and you never notice unless you test it specifically. Why do we have this design? Because our eye evolved from light-sensitive cells embedded in nerve tissue. The photoreceptors ended up on the inner layer of what became the retina, and the wiring was on the outside. It was locked in early, before enough complexity existed to reroute it. We've been working around it ever since. And then there's the control center, the organ that supposedly makes all of this worthwhile, the human brain. Your brain is not one unified system. It's layers of evolutionary additions stacked on top of each other like software updates that were never fully integrated. At the core, you have ancient structures shared with reptiles, regulating breathing, heart rate, reflexes. Around that, structures shared with other mammals, emotion, memory, social bonding. And on top of all that, the massive human neocortex, language, planning, abstract thought, the ability to be anxious about something that isn't happening yet. These systems don't always agree. In fact, they frequently conflict. Your amygdala, part of that ancient emotional system, can trigger a full stress response to a work email. Your heart rate spikes, stress hormones flood your bloodstream, your body mobilizes for physical danger, because the amygdala can't always tell the difference between a threatening predator and a passive-aggressive message from your manager. Meanwhile, your prefrontal cortex, the rational planning region, knows perfectly well it's just an email. It's trying to talk the amygdala down. But the emotional system is older, faster, and louder. Reason frequently loses. This mismatch explains a lot. Why we're terrible at assessing statistical risk, but hypervigilant about unlikely threats. Why we crave sugar and fat in quantities that were useful when calories were scarce, but cause chronic disease when they're everywhere. why social rejection activates the same neural pathways as physical pain, because in our ancestral environment, being cast out of the group genuinely could kill you. The prefrontal cortex, the very thing that allows you to listen to a video essay about evolutionary biology and understand it critically, is also the thing that keeps you up at 2 a.m. replaying a conversation from 6 years ago. It's powerful enough to simulate possible futures, which is amazing for planning, and also the engine of anxiety and rumination when it won't turn off. We built the most sophisticated prediction machine in the known universe, and we use a significant portion of its capacity to worry about things that will never happen and cringe at things that already have. So here's where we land. The human body is not a masterpiece. It's a palimpsest, layers of old code with new features written on top, compromises made under survival pressure, designs locked in by accident before anyone could revisit them. You choke because you inherited a throat from a fish. Your back hurts because you started walking upright before your spine could redesign itself. Human birth is dangerous because brains and hips both had to evolve at the same time and never reconciled. You have a blind spot your brain papers over every second of every day, and your own emotions can hijack your rational thinking before you even know it's happening. And yet, and this is the part that's genuinely remarkable, this cobbled-together, retrofitted, barely adequate biological machine is the same one that figured out DNA, composed symphonies, built the internet, and is currently diagnosing its own design flaws using the exact brain that has those design flaws. Evolution doesn't build for perfection. It builds for good enough to survive long enough to reproduce. We made it this far not because we're optimally designed, but because we were sufficiently designed, just barely enough times over an almost incomprehensible stretch of time. The body you're living in is 4 billion years of evolutionary duct tape and biological compromise, and somehow it got you here.